Okay, let's kick this off. So this is our second Culture of Care Forum, and we are excited to have it coincide with Black History Month. Increasing diversity on our job sites and cultivating a culture which helps retain that talent is a driving force for Culture of Care and our members' dedication to diversity and inclusion. What we can do and what we can do to create inclusive job site cultures where these community members will thrive. A special thanks to our steering committee who helped us develop the featured program, covering some aspects of Black history in the construction industry by looking at pivotal events in the 60s and 70s, which led to greater job site integration and affirmative action. We're also excited to have Bryn Huneke from AGC of America join us to walk you through the Culture of Care Anti-Racism Toolkit. Of course, these items will be brought to you after our sharing segment, where we will cover successes, challenges, and incidents since our last forum. Paneling Mandy Pine, your moderator for this segment, put your thinking caps on now and please be prepared to share. So before we jump into the rest of the agenda, we'd like to take a few minutes to announce two $1,000 grants to support local organizations who are helping to attract more Black workers to the construction industry. The Love To pre-apprenticeship program is led by Pastor Lawrence Willis. AGC has been proud to support Pastor Willis' mentorship work in the past and is pleased to assist once again. This program trains and supports low-income, underrepresented, and ethnic minority students the necessary skills to enter into the construction trades. The curriculum includes trade certification, job readiness, fitness and nutrition, math, hand and power tool use and safety, tape measure reading, resume and soft skill teaching, and material handling and ID. We are very happy to be supporting Love To in funding to train their next 20 individuals. The current cost of supporting one student is $563. If your company would like to contribute funds to this excellent program or otherwise assist mentorship of students, please contact Pastor Willis. We have put his contact information in the chat box, and Pastor Willis is with us today in the meeting this morning. If you would like to message him and ask questions, please use the chat feature to do so. Bringing new and underrepresented individuals into our construction trades can sometimes require additional support to assist in completion of training and apprenticeship, support for relicensing, transportation assistance, books, supplies, nutrition, tuition, and even credit counseling for first-time home buyers. Our apprenticeship graduation rates improve dramatically when they are in place. And for that reason, AGC is proud to support Urban League's construction trade program. CTP is a grant-funded referral and guidance resource to help individuals obtain pre-apprenticeship training, preparatory training, union and non-union construction employment. Tamisha Steele, CTP's program coordinator, is here in the meeting with us today, along with a number of their staff. Please feel free to reach out to her in the chat with interest or questions about supporting their program. And here we would like to show you a short video to illustrate how these programs impact young people and how good training and mentorship can change lives. So fingers crossed that this will play for you all.
My name is Arvell Norwood. I went to Rainier Beach High School, graduated 2019.
My name is Kingsley Namaka. I went to Rainier Beach High School and I graduated the year 2019.
Growing up, seeing all my friend group, my older brothers getting into trouble, and then not being able, as older, not being able to find a good job, I just felt like I didn't want that to happen to me.
Growing up in the hood and seeing all my brothers and stuff, you know, struggle and stuff, I feel like that really painted the picture for me. I really struggle.
And being in a system where the police, whoever's all up life, all up in your situation, I didn't want to have to do that. I just wanted to work for a good cause, work for real money, a check, nothing else. The good way, the only way. Pastor Willis, he been low-key so me up with games since I was little, telling me about this. Saying like, don't, you gonna have on the way out. We're going to get you into the trades.
Through construction, through the trades, it will help have other options that you'll now be competing in another market, but you need more experience in that market and starting in high school, because you know the high school counselors will talk about college and what's available, but also we should be talking about the avenue of construction.
I have no experience in construction at all. So it's like, I don't know if I really want to do this, brother. And he was like, shit, because, you know, it's going to help you out in the long run. So I'll give it a try. Once the program starts, gave it a try, started like construction for what it is. Can actually see the possibility and things.
I'm a hands-on worker, so construction is easy to me. I'm a fast learner. All you gotta do is give me the basics, get it like that.
There are so many tradesmen that are in construction, so we want to be able to fill the pipeline with new young people in on the trade, so they can skill.
That video, I always love to see that. And once again, both Love2 and CTP contact information is in the chat. And please consider supporting the. Just a second. There we go. Okay, so now for our featured speaker. As contractors, we know that increasing the representation of Black workers on our job sites is not a union or non-union issue. And of course, the Culture of Care platform exists to support both signatory and non-signatory contractors who are seeking to bring more people of color into their job sites. Many of our members also do public work, and as most of you know, some public owners use project labor agreements to favor union workers, while they include mechanisms to prioritize dispatch from the union hiring hall for people of color. We also know 98% of Black-owned businesses are non-union, so these same PLA mechanisms that work to increase Black worker participation tend to leave out the diverse workforces of these non-union Black-owned companies. Now, it may feel odd to insert this little policy comment here, but it's really important reminder that the history of Black community participation in our industry is a very complex and present-day concern, an issue we're still grappling with as we all strive to increase access to our industry for people of color. So without further ado, here to teach us a little more about the past history of the policy of affirmative action and legal efforts for integrating our construction industry is Dr. Trevor Griffey. We are extremely lucky to have Dr. Griffey here today to share his field of study and expertise. Dr. Trevor Griffey is a lecturer in labor studies at UCLA and in U.S. history at UC Irvine. As a doctoral student at the University of Washington, he co-founded the Seattle Civil Rights and Labor History Project, wrote a dissertation about the United Construction Workers Association in Seattle, and co-edited the book, Black Power at Work, Community Control, Affirmative Action, and the Construction Industry for Cornell University Press in 2010. He currently serves as Vice President of the University Council American Federation of Teachers in UC Irvine, and he lives in Long Beach, California. Welcome, Dr. Griffey, and I think at this time you will take over the presentation and show your slides.
Great, well, thank you for having me. And my apologies in advance if you hear either dogs snoring, dog barking, or dog running. This whole working from home thing is, oh, okay, it looks like I can do that. This whole working from home thing has created new experiences for all of us, as well as new norms. And so my hope is that you're patient with the fact that my living conditions are also my working conditions. And dogs don't pause for Zoom meetings. And she would be barking at the door if I locked her out of this room. So that's just what's going on. So thank you all for having me I should say that I neither endorse nor don't endorse the statement that preceded this in terms of what is the significance of the history I'm going to present. That is up to you all to decide and discuss. And I don't want to step between contractors and unions in their ongoing kind of negotiations. But I do want to provide a little bit of history for some of the negotiations that you find yourselves in, both with the law and with labor unions. And so my presentation is a little more about the origins and a little less about the development of affirmative action in the construction industry in Seattle, but also in the United States. Because the fact is that the construction industry in the United States and battles to desegregate it are at the center of the history of affirmative action itself and the history of demands for enforcement of civil rights law in ways that are not just tokenistic, but are meaningful and substantial. So let me kind of get started with a story. The story is about a man named Howard Lewis, who was a construction worker in Seattle, who was dispatched out to work on one of the dams on the Columbia River in 1965 by the iron workers, Local 86. And as part of being on the job, he heard people making disparaging remarks about African Americans, and he spoke up. He said, you know, I may be light-skinned and you may not notice this, but I'm African American and I take umbrage at what you're saying. I think that what you're doing is racist and I don't want to hear it at my workplace. What Lewis then experienced following this exchange was difficulty getting further dispatch out to Wells Dam and out to future jobs from the iron workers hiring hall. At the time, he had a sort of permit to go through the hiring hall, but he wanted journeyman status so that that status could be a basis for his prioritization for dispatch. But he was never able to get it. And even though he had shown, because of his work, that he was an exceptional welder, he was unable to actually get through the tests that would have given him journeyman status, with him being asked to do things that most people would have never been asked to do to reach that status, including learning how to tie all sorts of different kinds of knots. And then at the end of one of his tests, after he successfully even accomplished that, they asked him to tie a knot that he's pretty sure never existed, and then he was flunked for that reason. The reason I tell you that story is partly because had Howard Lewis been darker complected, he probably wouldn't have received dispatch at all. But the fact that he got in before being pushed out provided a basis through which to document something that people had long suspected, but had had a difficult time proving, which was that the union hiring halls in skilled trades, much less so in lower skilled trades, but in sheet metal, plumbers and pipe fitters, operating engineers, electrical workers, and iron workers, that these hiring halls, while supposed to prioritize union members for dispatch, also had the effect of using access to union membership to engage in racial discrimination, such that even if somebody passed as white, that their identification as non-white might cause them to lose this privileged access to the hiring hall. This is important not just as a narrative for thinking about what is race and how does it or does it not structure job opportunities in workplace culture, but it's also important because Howard Lewis filed a complaint with a statewide organization newly tasked with enforcing Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Many people forget, you know, before you go to the EEOC, you have to go through this statewide legal apparatus first. So he filed this complaint. It took years to resolve. There was lots of political controversy. And in the end, while the unions were found guilty of discrimination after very public and contentious hearings, little change was able to be effected except for kind of the individuals noted. Maybe they could get hiring now and priority hiring or union membership through government litigation that would take years. But what about all those other people who couldn't get that status? That was where things were in Seattle in the late 1960s. And Seattle in that regard was not exceptional. Seattle was frankly normal for most of the Midwest, the Northeast, and the West, where unions were stronger, where they had used the hiring hall after Taft-Hartley as a way of retaining some kind of union density in the construction industry. So now let's see if I can advance this slide using, okay, good. And so it's in this context that you see African-American contractors, many of them who are simply workers with little access to capital, who were excluded from unions, advocating that they should receive priority for hiring on public buildings in African-American communities. The clear line of argument was that the federal government at the time, through war on poverty programs, in particular model cities, but not exclusively so, was investing millions and millions of dollars in building new facilities, community centers, swimming pools, schools, but that this was bringing a predominantly white workforce into predominantly people of color neighborhoods, and that this, given high structural unemployment in those neighborhoods, was a site of political contention, and African-American contractors said, we should get a cut of this, but we're excluded because of union rules on public construction. And so as a result, Seattle contractors, who organized in part in dialogue with model cities, but who got impatient with the slow pace of change, started showing up to public construction sites, telling the contractors, this job is closed. This job is closed until it hires more African-American workers. And they started at a swimming pool that was about to be named after the fallen civil rights icon Medgar Evers in Seattle's Central District, but then moved downtown to county construction buildings, moved up north to the University of Washington. Any place there was government contracts, they said the law already says there should be no discrimination. But our argument is the law is not being enforced, and we have to enforce it ourselves. Now, in some ways, for labor historians, this would actually be a familiar story, in that the idea of workers showing up to a workplace and saying the law says one thing, but you're doing another, that's what the labor activist mobilizations of the 1930s and 40s were about. The Wagner Act had been passed, but you had to see lots of direct action by workers to get employers to even bargain with unions. But now you saw a different kind of politics drawing on labor history of African-American workers excluded from the most lucrative positions in the industry, using labor movement and Black freedom movement tactics to try to challenge the labor relations model established by the New Deal. This was part of a nationwide movement. It had been building for years, and some argue that its origins are with Philadelphia activists in the late 1950s or early 1960s. Certainly the contention around these issues had been decades long. You start to see direct action around it in 1963 in the Northeast, but it built over time, and by fall of 1969, starting with Chicago and then moving to Seattle and Boston and other places, you see similar kind of Black community control protests that overlap with Black power politics happening at publicly funded construction sites around the country. So Seattle is part of this nationwide movement. And in Seattle, as elsewhere, you saw major labor union resistance to the demands for inclusion of African-American workers on these construction sites. The reason that was officially given was not one that was overtly white supremacist. It was not saying this is a whites-only space. It was saying this is a trick by non-union contractors to try to break our apprenticeship system and our hiring halls by using people of color to go in through the back door. And so, so there was this sort of assumption that employers had long been looking for a way to break unions, but if you brought in people who were not officially apprentices, paid them sub-apprentice helper wages, if you brought in people who weren't journeymen and paid them less, but did it in the name of diversity, you'd also be breaking the union. And so they said this was union busting, and that there was no discrimination, but then they went further and said there was no racial discrimination in the trades. And that itself was simply not true. And so instead of reckoning with that discrimination that might also overlap with employer discrimination as well, they mass mobilized protests against federal government consideration and imposition of affirmative action rules. And so here on the left, you see a mass march of building trades workers in Olympia carrying signs like "We build, not burn," "Build, baby, build," "Reliable men finish high school," that on the one hand says we're construction workers and we're proud and we're wearing hard hats on our march, but on the other sort of suggests that African American protests are destructive, that they are unpatriotic, that people who would apply for these positions don't deserve them, didn't finish high school, didn't earn them, that even observers at the time thought this might be a kind of overt expression of racism, but in somewhat coded language. But as a result of, and I should say this entire time, there's this kind of complex thing where government officials are trying to step in between employers and unions saying, we've got this mess, we need to resolve it. And employers say, well, pay us more and we'll hire more Black workers. Unions are saying, use our hiring halls and use our apprenticeship systems. And both sides are pointing their fingers at the other. And as a result of nothing happening, and building trades union officials or building trades union leaders not budging, protests escalate. So at the University of Washington, protesters push a bulldozer into an open pit where they're building Red Square. They also briefly march out onto the runway at SeaTac Airport to protest the lack of diversity at workers at the Port of Seattle. And so now I will show you some video from this history to give you a look at some of these protests and the way that they were talked about on national media. If you can't hear this, please shout out because I might not see any texts or messages you send me in nonverbal ways. Let's see. Can you?
Philadelphia plan an order to contractors doing federal building to hire a fixed percentage of minority group employees, which is to say Negroes. Unions and contractors object. They say it is illegal. They say it is just as illegal to hire anyone because of his race as it is to refuse to hire him because of his race. They also object that a quota for a minority group can also become a quota against them, an excuse for hiring only so many and then refusing to hire any more. But the order from the Labor Department is now in effect, and perhaps it'll be settled in court. The Assistant Secretary of Labor, Arthur Fletcher, had a news conference about it.
As far as I'm concerned, the unemployment of non-whites is not a social problem. When you don't have any money in your pocket, that's not a social problem. That's an economic problem. We would recognize that when farmers and other people in this society...
Today, the failure to hire anyone race, being to hire anymore.
As far as I'm concerned...
Sorry about that.
The unemployment of non-whites is not a social problem. When you don't have any money in your pocket, that's not a social problem. That's an economic problem. We would recognize that when farmers and other people in this society were having economic problems, we did things that were closely in the economic things to get change. For example, we came up with special legislation. When we realized that the farmers were not making an economic comeback, we did special things to aim federal money into the farm market. And then the thing we told the farmer is keep working, keep producing your crop. And we'll buy that crop if necessary and store it somewhere and disperse it to India and various other places. But we're going to keep you working. This was in recognition that the farmers had an economic problem when they weren't making money, not a social problem. Okay, the same is true with non-whites. They have an economic problem when they're not making money. The Philadelphia plan is an economic effort to see to it that when we expend federal money, that we also channel some of that money into depressed neighborhoods, non-white neighborhoods. We have two ways of getting money in there. One is through welfare, and one is through employment. The Nixon administration is committed to employment.
The AFL-CIO building trades unions meeting in Atlantic City heard their union leaders denounce the whole idea. They said, quote, "We cannot accept the simplistic idea that the arithmetic of a population ratio shall be the standard for employment in the building trade. The last figure we have shows non-white workmen have about 7.5% of the union construction jobs, while the black population of the country is about 10 to 12%. Undersecretary of Housing Richard Van Dusen told the unions today that was not enough."
At the University of Washington this morning, about 170 people who want more minorities on construction jobs tried to oppose a university building project, which they said did not hire enough black workers.
Yes, for one thing, and that's what we come out for. And that's what the generation is project down.
One group leader said that since the contractors did not respect equal employment laws, the demonstrators need not respect the contractors' property. With that, the crowd began moving, but a white pump operator who didn't suffered a broken nose. The crowd then turned on the equipment, and according to Seattle police, did about $5,000 damage. Two service trucks loaded with coal down the hill. Then they dumped a bulldozer on top. Seattle police grouped off campus 30 minutes after they were called. 24 patrolmen entered the area. By then, the damage was done. The company had closed the project for the day. The crowd remained angry. Between 60 and 70 policemen were eventually called in. 11 demonstrators were arrested. Today's closure was the fifth in 2 weeks, and 4 other sites used personnel walked off the job rather than work with black trainees.
So you hear a few different things, and we can talk more about it in sort of the Q&A after. The first is that affirmative action policy is pioneered as a response to Black Freedom Movement protests. That it is first rolled out for the construction industry, starting in Philadelphia and then modeled for the nation. That this then becomes a precedent that is applied to all federal contractors and to federal agencies that goes beyond construction itself. But this is the Black Freedom Movement origins of demands that saying that you only consider people, in an equal opportunity way, but then continuing to hire an all-white workforce, that can no longer be seen as sufficient. And so this is an issue that becomes politically polarizing and a lightning rod for kind of a reorganization of American politics. But one of the things that happens with the federal government taking the lead, and with fairly widespread, but certainly not universal sympathy with protesters, is that state and local agencies start passing their own affirmative action laws as well. So Governor Evans, a liberal Republican, County Executive Spellman, a liberal Republican, Mayor Ullman, I believe a Democrat, all oversee the passage of either executive orders or laws over the next few months in response to these protests that also include affirmative action mandates in public government construction. The Port of Seattle also passes regulations. So this is a kind of chain reaction. I should also note for people especially interested in Washington state history that Arthur Fletcher, the sort of main figurehead of promoting this for the Nixon administration's Department of Labor, had previously run in 1968 and almost won as lieutenant governor for Washington, which would have been a fairly significant win. And so that's part of how he gets rewarded in the Nixon administration. But because of widespread resistance, Seattle ends up being different than much of the rest of the country in its experience of these issues. And much of the rest of the country, fear of more protest means that often, but not always, urban league representatives join a bargaining process for creating what the Department of Labor calls a hometown plan that sets rough goals for hiring of non-white workers, sometimes specifically black workers, on local construction sites. The enforcement is often pretty weak, and the results don't end up being great, but at the same time, it's a beginning. What happens in Seattle is because the local building trades don't want to work with the Urban League and don't actually believe that they should even have to sign off on a hometown plan, the Department of Justice brings a Title VII lawsuit against them. The operating engineers, seeing this lawsuit coming down, separate from the building trades itself and I think from the Labor Council, but certainly from the Building Trades Council, and they settle. But the electrical workers, plumbers and pipe fitters, sheet metal workers, and iron workers, they're all brought to court by the U.S. Department of Justice for a pattern and practice of racial discrimination in their hiring halls and apprentice systems. And this is a major, major challenge. And in the end, they end up losing quite badly. And the federal judge imposes affirmative action on them in a much stronger way than would have happened elsewhere, by requiring the immediate hiring of all 41 African-American workers who testified that they had been excluded from the trades and bringing them in as journeymen, but also, and this is the novel part, creating what they called a special apprenticeship program parallel to the apprenticeship program in the trades that requires 1 trainee per 4 journeymen there. As a result of this litigation, and especially this major court-imposed desegregation plan that is then, with adjustments, going to hang over Seattle's construction industry for the next decade, a new organization forms that is unlike most other organizations that you find around the country. There's one in Boston called United Community Construction Workers. There's one in New York called Harlem Fight Back. But these are Black worker organizations that rise up to kind of watchdog the enforcement of affirmative action plans, autonomous from the Urban League and from community organizations. They tend to be engaged in direct action politics and tend to be pretty militant. They are pro-labor but critical of union conservatism. And here in Seattle, they're led by someone who is almost a kind of Martin Luther King figure for some people from the Seattle area, a man named Tyree Scott, who has support from the American Friends Service Committee in basically trying to watchdog the enforcement of the court order. One of the things that I think is really interesting about what the UCWA does early on is it forms a kind of collective of support for workers brought into a hostile workplace. So the first people brought in as trainees or potential journeymen into workplaces where union leadership had told their members, they are here to bust your union, was to treat them like they did not belong, to not train them, to not give them productive work. And so the UCWA works to pool all these stories and then advocate on their behalf, and also sometimes go on strike as a kind of like civil rights strike in these early places to try to negotiate a space where Black workers would be treated with respect. And so here's an example of a story from one worker who was part of trying to, he was an early worker kind of operating in the sheet metals union, and he described some of his experience in the 1970s. This is John Yates, and this is oral history that some of the workers associated with the UCWA themselves, they filmed themselves and interviewed each other in the early 2000s.
It was so cold that they were doing, okay, when it's a 4-year apprenticeship. So, I mean, you start off with first year apprentice is like 55% of a journeyman scale. Second year, you know, you go up. 4th year apprentice, you make an 85% scale, right? So in your 4th year, you're almost a journeyman. You're supposed to be able to, like Alvin was saying, do real good work. You know, you're honing your craft, right? I was a 4th year apprentice, and they didn't really never like my show, you know, because I can, you know, come on, I know what you got to do. I know how the rules are, and I know how to make them work for me. So the superintendent says, Yates, go sweep out the shack. You know, I'm a 4th year apprentice, you know, I started to go crazy. I looked at him, I said, yeah, okay, this is about 11 o'clock. I went into the shack. First, I locked the door. I cleaned the shack like it was my house, put everybody's name plates, and went to sleep for 3 hours, and then let them in when it was time to get off. They never asked me to clean the shack no more.
So I shared
so cold.
I shared John's story not in a celebratory way, but to acknowledge that there are very serious kinds of negotiations taking place over what is and what is not illegitimate work, over a hazing culture in the construction trades that had been normative, where it was supposed to be redemptive. Like a lot of homosocial spaces, whether it's the military or football team or whatever, you might be punished as a young person and degraded, but you're supposed to be brought into a brotherhood, right? But if you're not welcome there in the first place, these questions come up about whether this punitive hazing behavior is actually trying to tear somebody down. So these kinds of resistance practices become common, and there are even some stories in the early 1970s when things were at their height where people are bringing guns to the workplace, or they're having near-miss accidents that are quite scary, that many people suspect are intentional. But so just to sum up, though, is that basically Seattle was unusual in going through this. And I also want to note, and this is maybe a historical note, that the other form of resistance that is very hard to document, but that I think we can't avoid acknowledging, is that in the Northeast, some of these unions are mobbed up, like they have mafia infiltration. And so some of the attempts to control access to who's hired and dispatched not only involve white privilege, but also involve organized crime in ways that are really hard to untangle. And only the documentary record of attempts to get the organized crime out of, say, the New York building trades in the late 80s and early 90s gives us just a slight sense of how these things could have overlapped, but that political history will never be fully known. My understanding is in Seattle and in the Northwest, this is much less of an issue at this time, even if there may be some problems from time to time.
Because sometimes, but you did a good job of explaining everything.
Give me one more second, and I'll finish up. I apologize. So I just want to note a few legacies before I take questions, and I apologize if I've gone too long. First, I want to recognize that as part of attempts to desegregate the construction industry and promote laws throughout the region that are promoting equal opportunity, that labor activism is part of it. And this shapes Seattle's politics and its left, primarily through an organization called the Labor and Employment Law Office, which goes by the acronym LELO. And even though they've changed their name to have a different standing, the LELO is still a phrase you'll hear used, and they're also affiliated with a group that you may encounter called Got Green. The other thing I would note is that some legacies are, first, this is how public construction sites become a site of political contention over race and community or local control, that you can trace it back to this moment. This is both the origin of affirmative action, because equal employment law was not seen as sufficient to address the problems in the industry, but then also the origin of some of the backlash politics that you see targeting affirmative action, going so far as to make it illegal in some states, including in Washington. This is a precedent that that women activists use in the mid to late 70s to open the door even further to desegregate the industry. Also, minority set-aside programs being separate from these kinds of hometown plans and court orders means that sometimes workplace diversity issues and contractor issues get separated, even though they were united during the protest phase of the 1960s. The results are not as good as you would think, and arguably that's because workplace culture is something that is much harder to change through law. And the kind of hazing practices end up driving a lot of people out. But there are some incredible stories of pioneers who survived the hazing, who put up with it, who think they're leaving a legacy for future generations. And from my limited experience, my understanding is both women and people of color in IBEW 46, while it's not perfect, feel that they have made inroads that perhaps further than has happened in, say, sheet metal or iron workers. But there is a legacy that all workers, I think, draw from in Seattle that traces back to some of this. And then finally, this was a moment when I think the labor movement itself kind of could have gone one way and it went another. and by actively resisting affirmative action, weakened itself as employers at the national level sought to deunionize the industry and blame construction unions for inflation during the 1970s. So you see a kind of draining of union resources and a weakening of their political power as they resisted these things rather than kind of adapting to them. So that's where I would end my presentation. Let me see if, no, I don't want to leave the meeting. How do I, there we go. So I hope I haven't talked too long. I probably have, but I am open to whatever questions you may have, either about things I've presented. I'm also totally okay if you all say, you know what, we don't want to talk about history, we want to talk about the present. That's totally fine. I'm just not an expert in it, so I really want to defer to you about what's going on in your industry now. But I hope this was helpful for your thinking about some of the historical roots of the things that you wrestle with. And thank you again for having me.
I want to just say thank you so much. This was so amazingly helpful for me personally to really have this very well done presentation on the history of something that we are all here to really digest and learn about. And I would be welcome to have a little bit of awkward silence right now while we let you all sort of gather your thoughts and come forward with questions. I think this is a great opportunity to ask Dr. Griffey some questions that might be on your mind, and really, you know, no question is off the table. So I'm just gonna be quiet here and unmute yourself and shoot out a question.
So, Sonia, can I just want to say, Dr. Griffey, good presentation, because if we don't know the history where we were, we ain't gonna know where we're going. And so you relayed so much why I do what I do in construction, because the people that were in that slide, I know personally. And matter of fact, on last year, I received the Tyree Scott Award for working in construction. So all that history led up to where I'm at today of, you know, doing what I do in the community, working with contractors, working with projects so we can make it safer, better, and we can all be able to, you know, understand each other. That's what a culture, understanding a culture of a people, you got to know the history of them. And so that was a good pattern to see that history, and then let me know personally that I'm on the right track working with the people that I'm working with now, and seeing the history of the Urban League in that slide. It just gave me confirmation of what my journey looks like in my purpose in working with you all. So thank you.
Yeah, well, that is a huge honor to receive the Tyree Scott Award. I should also note the Low Income Housing Institute named an apartment complex after him. Yes. That I believe is in Southeast Seattle. I don't recall, but you know, I wasn't engaging in hyperbole when I said some people do refer to him as sort of their local Martin Luther King. The love for Tyree and the maintaining of his memory is very, very deep and wide in the Seattle area.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
We are pleased to have with us here today Bryn Huneke, and as Director of Diversity and Inclusion at the Associated General Contractors of America, Bryn Huneke is responsible for promoting effective diversity and inclusion practices within the National Association. It's 89 chapters and 27,000 member companies. In this role, Bryn works with a passionate group of volunteer members to create a comprehensive diversity and inclusion strategy for AGC of America. Strategic priorities include diversifying AGC's existing membership, building a welcoming and engaging association environment, and providing member companies with tools they need to implement diversity and inclusion programs within their respective companies. As part of the Culture of Care program, today, Bryn will be walking through the newest resources for Culture of Care, a Racism in the Workplace Toolkit, and providing a quick update on the national program. So Bryn is now going to go ahead and take over and run through a few slides. As she does that, I would just say it's been such a pleasure to work with Bren over the last few years, and particularly in 2019 and 20, when the Culture of Care program got rolled out nationally, and we're very proud of that. So Bren is a great colleague and collaborator with our state program.
Thanks so much, Sonia. And I just want to, reciprocate the kind words you just said about me. It's been an absolute pleasure working with you and AGC of Washington. And I'm so grateful for the Culture of Care program that you all started in Washington State and continue to grow and, have new ideas and want to collaborate with AGC of America so we can offer a lot of this to all of our members and, our chapters across the country. So thank you for that. I just want to start by giving everyone a quick update on the National Culture of Care program and where it currently stands. We have seen really good and positive progress around culture of care nationwide over the last 9 months or so that we've really, been pushing this out and have an active program, even despite COVID and all of the things that have happened over the last year. So we're currently at 454 pledged companies, and that includes 25 of our chapters, and AGC of America has also taken the pledge. So we are implementing and looking to make sure that the association, not just the industry, and supporting our construction companies in building more inclusive workplaces, but making sure that the association is an inclusive space for members as well. In addition to that, in addition to the company pledge that we have for the national program, we also have a personal pledge that individuals can go on, and they can take that personal pledge and make a personal commitment to creating a culture of care within their own workspace. And we have received a really positive response with our personal pledge too. We've had over 1,230 actually personal pledge commitments that have been made so far, and continue to see a lot of support and progress for that personal pledge. And we really view it as a positive tool for individuals to feel empowered to take action. As part of the national program, one of the things that we're always looking to do is to continue to develop new resources to support member companies' efforts in building inclusive workplaces. With the protests and everything that happened last summer, throughout the fall, we really felt like it was important to start to focus more directly and have more targeted conversations related to issues of discrimination in the workplace. And, talking about racism first seemed like a very logical and necessary and critical step that we needed to help companies take. And, there was a strong desire, I think, from a lot of companies out there to have authentic discussions and focus specifically on racism, not just diversity and inclusion, but specifically on racism and how it might manifest itself in the construction industry. So last fall, we developed and released a Racism in the Workplace toolkit to help member companies have a more in-depth conversation about race and racism, how racism looks in the construction industry, and what you can do as a company to help prevent incidences of racism from happening, and also what to do when they may occur. So we developed a series of 4 toolbox talks and a corresponding discussion guide to really help companies have this conversation with their workforce. And, I want to make notes, and it says this in the discussion guide, but, this is meant to be delivered similar to like a safety stand down. So, I know a lot of times toolbox talks are kind of given, employees read them, they sign them, and they turn them back in. We really want this to be something that can be used as a group discussion, because we think this is an important enough conversation that it warrants time to stop and really have this conversation with your colleagues or with your employees. And, you know, these toolbox talks kind of have an order to them, but they don't have to be delivered all at the same time. You know, they can be spread out over a few days or a few weeks, or, you know, whatever is right and appropriate for your company. So to start, I just want to outline a little bit of the discussion guide and kind of some of the resources that are in the discussion guide. It's really important when you're having a conversation around racism with your employees that you do some prep work before you have this conversation to make sure that you really understand why you're having the conversation and what your outcome is, your desired outcome is from having the conversation. It needs to be authentic. That needs to be expressed to your employees from your leadership about why this conversation is important and what the goal is, what the outcome is of having the conversation. Because if you're just having the conversation to check a box and say that you've done it, you can end up doing a lot more harm than good. So make sure that you're really thinking about what your purpose is behind wanting to have this conversation. It's really important to be transparent in that regard. It's also important to identify the right facilitator to have this conversation. You know, it might be hiring an outside consultant to help you have this conversation. It might be somebody in your leadership who is the right person to have this conversation. Maybe it's a couple of people, but really identifying who that person should be to deliver this talk, to make sure that they understand how to hold this conversation, which may be uncomfortable for a lot of people. Really understand how to hold this conversation, how to guide the conversation, how to create safety in that space for people to be able to express themselves. And then, you know, before you hold this conversation, really important to identify some ground rules. To have the conversation, make sure they're clear and articulated up front about what those ground rules are, to make sure that this maintains a safe space, and that while maybe it's an emotional conversation, everybody leaves that conversation okay at the end of it. So there is, you know, some guidance kind of around some of these bullet points that I'm mentioning in this document to help you think about that prep work that you need to do before you have the conversation. There's also in the discussion guide some guidance specifically dedicated to each of the 4 toolbox talks, and some additional, you know, discussion items, you know, questions that you can ask to help facilitate the conversations around each of the toolbox talks. Really just some guidance for facilitators to be able to create effective conversations around these toolbox talks. And then lastly, in this discussion guide, it has a section that talks about follow-up and next steps, because like I said in the beginning about really being clear on your purpose and goals, this is not meant to be a one and done conversation. This needs to be something that is followed up with action by your company to show that authenticity and desire to affect change. So there needs to be clear next steps following the discussion on whether it's reviewing workplace policies and practices, whether it's holding additional education and training, whatever that might be that makes sense for your company, whether it's, you know, creating an internal work group, but there needs to be some clearly identified and communicated next steps to make sure your employees know that you're serious about this conversation. So going into the 4 toolbox talks, the first one that we delivered was, or developed was understanding race and racism. We felt it was really important that everybody is starting from the same set of definitions and understands what race and racism are. So it walks through the differences in, you know, between race and ethnicity. It, you know, talks about what racism is. There are also some discussion questions in there where individuals can, you know, you can prompt and ask people to think about their identity, when's the last time they thought about it, how it affects, how they walk in the world, those kinds of discussion questions. And then it kind of differentiates the two different forms of racism, because oftentimes we talk about them in two different ways. There's both that individual level, which can be things like, racial slurs and, things that are coming from you as an individual. And then there are, forms of racism that are more at the structural level. And those are, unequal access to opportunity, to income, to education. And so it walks through kind of what that structural level looks like and some of the societal impacts. So the first one is meant to be, kind of just a laying the groundwork. The second one really goes into what racism looks like in construction. So this one, we outlined 5 different scenarios that include forms of racism, sometimes overt, sometimes more subtle, and sometimes unintentional from, one individual not meaning to, not being intentional in wanting to say something racist, but that, sometimes those things happen and they come out of somebody's mouth and they don't even realize the consequences of what they're saying. So by putting them in this scenario and then giving the facilitator the opportunity to ask some questions and guide some conversation around those scenarios can really help individuals who might not be aware to build that level of awareness and understanding about different forms of racism. So, some examples of scenarios are, assigning undesirable tasks to coworkers, based on the belief that, individuals or certain identity groups are, more suited to those types of tasks. Job performance being impacted because of cultural or language differences and how that might affect somebody's growth in a company. And then obviously things like racial slurs and jokes appearing written somewhere on a job site. So all of the scenarios, the 5 scenarios that are in here, are things that I have heard have happened in the construction industry. We tried to make them as relatable as we could to things that have maybe happened or somebody has experienced in their workplace. The third one really goes into talking about inclusion as a key component of safety culture. We work really hard to tie safety culture to inclusion and the importance of psychological safety to safety culture, and the impact that incidents of racism can have, not just on psychological safety to workers on a job site, but also potentially physical safety when somebody is affected psychologically because of an incident of racism. So we kind of walk through in this toolbox talk and talk about that connection between those two. And then not just the effects of racism on the individual who is the target, but also the effects of racism on bystanders, anybody who is around, who is a witness to that incident, and ultimately the impact on team dynamics, because all of those things ultimately affect safety on a job site. And then our last toolbox talk is some preventative measures and some ways that you can, as an individual, intervene, both if you witness an incident of racism, but also how you can proactively work to prevent them from happening again. So this one goes into a little bit about the responsibilities of bystanders to intervene, why somebody may not, but why it's really important that you as a bystander do that. So talking about some of those barriers to taking action and why somebody might not intervene. Maybe somebody doesn't know what to say or do. They're uncomfortable. They're not sure how to respond. There certainly can be workplace power dynamics at play. There can be, the fear of being a future target to other incidences of harassment, hazing, or bullying, and or fear of retaliation from the company. So those are all really real fears that individuals have in not wanting to step in, even if what they're witnessing is wrong and they know it's wrong and they believe it's wrong, that can oftentimes prevent somebody from wanting to take action. So we provide a number of strategies to help individuals overcome those barriers. You know, everything from using humor to change the subject, to ask questions to get clarification about what the offender is really meaning, to, you know, talking privately from, you know, with the offender and or reporting those incidents to upper management. So a number of ways that you can overcome those barriers. You can intervene, you can prevent incidences from happening in the future by making sure that you let your colleagues know that that type of behavior is not appropriate around you. So we hope it'll be an effective tool for people to use. You know, in addition to this toolkit related to racism, we're working on additional toolkits as well. We're currently developing a toolkit related to sexism in the industry and also LGBTQ+ discrimination, with additional ones planned in the works in the coming months. In addition to the toolkits, we're working on a couple other new resources for culture of care. The first one is a diversity, equity, and inclusion assessment tool. So basically what this tool will do will allow you to take a survey and answer questions in 4 key areas of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So everything from your workplace and leadership and culture to workforce and employee diversity and inclusion initiatives to your more external initiatives, so your community involvement and your supplier subcontractor diversity program. So you'll go through as a company, you'll answer these questions in these 4 areas. It will give you a scorecard at the end and give you a score in each of these 4 areas, letting you, I apologize if you can hear that, I'm getting a phone call coming in, but it'll give you a score in each of those 4 areas and allow you not only to take this assessment on an annual basis to see whether or not you're improving in those 4 areas, but will also allow you to see your score versus diversity, equity, and inclusion best practices, and also versus other industry construction companies. So other companies that have, not those specific companies, but an average of your competitors and where you fall compared to the rest of the construction industry. And then with that tool, as a way for you to be able to grow your scores, we will provide some recommended best practices and ways that you can continue to improve and develop in those 4 areas. And then last but not least, thanks to Sonia's incredible work with Rise Up, we are looking at a partnership with Rise Up to deliver some culture of care specific training. So taking the already fantastic Rise Up training that Anu has created and customizing that to fit culture of care's language, and deliver some culture of care specific training that you know we hope to be able to offer nationwide to all of our contractors. So those are a few of the resources that we have coming in the next, I would say probably 4 months is our target goal for a lot of these things to be delivered. So we're really excited to have a bunch of new tools coming out as part of culture of care, and then we'll look to continue to develop additional tools as those get launched. So again, the national website for the National Culture of Care program is buildculture.org. And of course, if any of you have any questions ever, my contact information is there. I'm always available to jump on a call and have a conversation with any of you. So thank you so much.